My name is Paul Fischer, and the hat that I'm wearing today is that I used to work for the State Department, which is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the United States government. And for the last 3 years, my role was to think about how video games can build cognitive resilience to propaganda and disinformation, right? So, how games can be this tool for media literacy. And so, that's going to be the topic of our discussion today. We have an incredible panel. I'm going to turn it over to each of you, maybe one on one, for a quick intro. Starting, let's see, going clockwise. Keisha, go ahead, a quick intro.
Hello, everyone. I'm Keisha Howard. I'm founder of Sugar Gamers and recently Sugar Gamers Labs. And we specialize more so in research and development. Right now, we're working on a game called Mindfo, which is a project that's both tangible and a video game that goes through all the terminology, all the definitions for a lot of tactics for propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation called Mindfo. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Keisha. Continuing in the clockwise, Luke, you're next for me.
Yeah, hi, I'm Luke Jayapalan. I'm a game designer at Filament Games, which is an educational game studio in Madison, Wisconsin. And we do a whole variety of different topics and platforms and age ranges. And Paul and I, for a time, we're working on a disinformation game around the Ukraine-Russia conflict for the Roblox platform.
Thanks,
Next.
Luke. Great to have you. And last but not least, Scott, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Scott Young. I am a researcher at Concordia University in Montreal and recently a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Washington. I've been making and studying games around disinformation, media manipulation, and fake news for the past 6 years, starting from escape rooms on echo chambers and filter bubbles to card games, board games, and even some hybrid kind of storytelling games for ages from middle school to elementary to high school and undergrad. So happy to talk about all those themes.
All right. Well, this is exciting. The panel that we brought for you today, we're bringing folks like Scott from academia. We're bringing folks like Keisha, who own their own studio, and folks like Luke, who are working really at the forefront of educational games. And this is really what we're intending to sort of dig into for the next 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. What sort of impact can we have with games? How is it that games can build cognitive resilience to propaganda and disinformation? And I think starting from, what is the difference between mis and disinformation is a good place to start. So misinformation, that prefix mis, like mistake, everyone misspeaks from time to time, right? Like you might say a billion when you meant to say a million, right? Accidents happen to everybody. Disinformation is when you are really intending to deceive. There is this intention of deception, right? To undermine trust, to sow discord, to disrupt unity. That's the purpose of disinformation. And, I think you could probably imagine or start to imagine why it is that disinformation can be so harmful. If we don't have sort of a common framework, a ground truth that we can all agree on, then it's hard to reach a consensus upon upon what to base our own opinions and ideas if we can't agree on a foundation of truth. And so we see disinformation around natural disasters, climate change, forest fires, earthquakes, whatever it might be. There's tons of disinformation that spreads like wildfire, pardon the pun, on social media after a natural disaster. But we also see disinformation after unnatural disasters. Luke alluded to the work that we were doing to build a game related to support for Ukraine, supporting Ukraine after Russia's invasion in 2022. Right, so that's an unnatural disaster. That was a disaster of Vladimir Putin's making, and we were building a game in order to spread fact-based information or be able to discern when somebody might be trying to deceive you. So let me start sharing my screen. Okay, hopefully folks are seeing my screen. Maybe I can get like a thumbs up or something. Yeah, perfect. Okay, I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between looking at you here and then going back to the slide. So if I'm not looking at you, just interrupt me. Um, all right, so here we have our wonderful panelists. And I'm just going to start out by describing some of the work that I was doing at the State Department and then throw it open to questions that I've rehearsed with our lovely panel. So this first game that we worked on was called Cat Park. It's a web browser-based game. It's intended to be played in 15 to 20 minutes. Um, and in this game, right, you sort of have this noir cityscape of Cat Park, in which you are trying to spread disinformation. You play the bad guy, and your goal is to undermine trust, to spread disinformation, to stir outrage about this outrageous public works project, a park for cats, right? What could be more stupid than a park for cats? And so we did that through this web browser based game, right? And in the game, sort of you meet these different characters who are teaching you different ways of spreading propaganda and disinformation. So memes, manipulated media, and sensational language. And you're using these different tools to spread polarization, conspiracy theories, sow discord, and undermine that trust. And what I'm demonstrating here on the screen is the woman on the far left of my screen, the blonde woman. Her name is Melanie in the English language version of the game. But what we were able to do with this game was to localize it for particular regions. So Maria in the middle of the screen is the version of the game that you would get if you were playing the game in Spanish, right? So we've not just translated the game, but we've truly localized the game for Latin America. So, the characters look different, the plot has been adapted, and our goal there is that the game will work. That the game will continue to have this statistically significant impact that we know that it does, right? We've measured the game's impact. We know that players are better after playing the game at discerning between reliable and unreliable information. Our hope is that, and what the evidence is starting to bear out, is that the localization is carrying through that impact to different regions in different languages. And the version on the far right is the sub-Saharan African version of this game. This is the version of the game that you would get if you were playing the game in Amharic, which is spoken in Ethiopia. Um, so Cat Park and its sort of sister game, Harmony Square, these are web browser-based games. They're both designed to be played in 15 to 20 minutes. But, occasionally you get sort of like in the government, you get a more difficult challenge. So we got this demand signal to do work in Tanzania. And we had to figure out a way to bolster media literacy in Tanzania. Okay, well, how am I going to get my game played in Tanzania? There isn't sort of the internet infrastructure to enable our game to be played there, as successfully and outside of major city centers. So what we discovered is that there's a master toll-free number for the entire country. And you dial this master toll-free number, and then you might get a menu of options, like 1 for weather, 2 for banking, 3 for maternal health. And we thought, why not press 4 to play a game? So in Safari Singida, this game is played entirely by dialing a toll-free number, and then you're presented with these decision trees. 1 to do this, 2 to do this, the story will progress, and then you'll get additional decision trees. And right, the game is entirely in Swahili. This is a trailer that was basically created just for events like this. But the game entirely revolves around, disinformation spread on WhatsApp while you are on a bus trying to get to a village in time for a family wedding, right? So now I've shown you web browser-based games like Cat Park and Harmony Square. This game, which was, toll-free number-based, Luke described, and we'll describe it in a little bit more detail later, a game that we were doing in WhatsApp. But we've also done game jams. And really what I'm hoping to convey here is just sort of the breadth and depth of ideas of what you could do. This was another web browser-based game that came out of a game jam. But this game was intended to be played cooperatively between a young person and their grandparents. So it's not really 2 players, but it's intended for the young person to then take this game and have a conversation with their grandparent about online scams, right? And how bad actors might be trying to deceive them to, in the game, you have to buy a printer. And so it's like, oh, which is the real printer? The one that only has 5-star reviews, but all the reviews look kind of the same, or the one that has mostly positive reviews, doesn't have an average of 5, but has diverse scores, right? So it's okay, discerning, okay, is this a real printer or is this a fake printer? And just to sort of flesh this out one more time, this is a resource that you can check out, unitedwithukraine.games. And these were 20 games that were created from a game jam that we were running up until March of this year, when unfortunately my role, the game that Luke was working on, this game jam, and a number of other programs were all cut short by Doge, by Elon and the administration. But there are resources out there for you. A lot of people have spent a lot of time thinking about, okay, what is it that I care about? How is it that disinformation can undermine or sow discord around that issue that I'm passionate about, that I care about, and how to convey that through a game that's both serious but also fun. So that's a quick intro. I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And now I'm going to jump back to questions. Hopefully, I don't see Keisha anymore. Hopefully, Keisha is still here.
Oh
There she
no.
is. Okay, great. Okay, sorry. You disappeared from sort of my, there you go. All right, now I see you. All right, great. So now I'm going to start asking questions of the three of you. And if you want me to sort of pull back those visuals, let me know. The first question that I have is, tell me a little bit more about what drew you to this topic. What drew you to an interest in making games about disinformation? So let's see. I can start with Keisha.
Yeah, I've been in my background is in psychology, or in my undergrad, and then I've been in gaming for 16 years now, which is insane, since 2008, since the last big recession we had. And I grew up during a time where games were transformative for me, in very impactful ways. Like games had a beginning, middle, and end, and the way games were made, the way they were profitable, are very different from today, where we have live ops and so on and so forth. But growing up in a space where the narrative of a game, or like beating a game, kind of sort of meant something, and it made me want to have friends. It made me, there were things that made me, in my opinion, a better human being for having played the games, having navigated some of those stories. So today, I still have that desire and that ambition to contribute to or create games that are going to make people better. And in 2025, I think the number one thing that I see that people urgently need is media literacy. And if we can use games to help people hone in on their observation skills, on their critical thinking skills, what better platform to use than, game mechanics. So yeah, that's what drew me to making games like this, because I think right now is the time for these kinds of games to be made and played. We urgently need these tools to help people, not get sucked into the matrix, if you will. So
Keisha, thank you. And right, I mean, everybody on this call knows it, right? Like just how impactful games can be when, rather than being a passive consumer of the media, you are an active participant, right? You are the hero or the anti-hero, and how much more powerful that makes the learning outcomes. Luke, go ahead. What drew you to this topic? I guess apart from me saying, hey, make this game.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, as far as impact games in general, I think I kind of learned I learned the appeal of that actually by doing that at Carnegie Mellon Entertainment Technology Center, and I didn't go in thinking necessarily I would become an educational game designer specifically. But I guess in hindsight, it made a lot of sense with other kind of educational things in my background, and I just love um, the kind of Wild West problem solving that creates, because we kind of know there's some conventions you can follow when you're making like a platformer, that you still have to figure out, how do I innovate? How do I build on those conventions? A lot of times I'm in spaces where I don't have a lot of conventions to draw on for what would make good game mechanics out of this learning objective, and I learned to really enjoy that. As far as disinformation in particular, yeah, in some ways the project came to me, but I think the thing that really got me interested in this topic was Gamergate. And like there was a YouTube channel called Innuendo Studios that was putting out videos about just like why are people so angry during Gamergate and like what's kind of going on in the psychology of that, because that was kind of a very, for me at least, it was a very negative feeling event in terms of like, what am I doing in games when this is kind of like what the community is kind of responding with. And yes, that was definitely one uh, that I think stands out in my mind. So yeah, if you haven't seen that, I think his name is Ian Dansk, and he has a lot of interesting videos on just like um, certain kinds of disinformation and how it spreads.
Mm, yeah, the Gamergate of was it 2014 or so, and then
Yeah.
also again last year or so. Um, it really hurt a lot of people in the industry who care about this art form in the same way that all of us do, and we're demeaned and targeted for who they are. Scott, go ahead. Last but not least.
For sure. I mean, I think anyone here in this call can understand that games are fun and enjoyable. I mean, you're probably not going to indicate unless you like games. And I come from a similar root of like I grew up playing games, whether it was board games on Friday nights or video games throughout high school. But then I went to teachers college, and from there I realized that there was like as much as we knew that games were helpful ways to learn, they weren't really being used in classrooms. And so while I was a teacher or finishing up my degree, I was like, well, there's a need for us to talk about how digital systems work. And there's not really any games available at the time to do so. So I pursued a master's kind of exploring those questions. I built an escape room as part of my master's thesis that looked at echo chambers and filter bubbles. And then I moved into doing a PhD. And when I went from master's to PhD, the question changed from what can games do to actually what is play doing in these spaces. And I know that like there's a pedantic conversation of what's the difference between games and play, between the systems and the actions we take on them. But for me, there was a larger question of how does play help us come to understand these really robust, nuanced, complex structures where all of us, or many of us, can probably understand that playing is a way that we explore the world. It's a way that we come to understand and form knowledge. And around 2020, when I started my thesis, started my PhD journey, we saw play being used also as a tactic. We saw it as a way to dismiss an opponent. So just in Gamergate is another example where you can say, oh, it's just a joke that we're saying problematic things. We saw, this intentional sharing of content where they were treating social media like a game to disinform and target individuals. We talk about playbooks and strategies when we talk about disinformation. And so for me, I was like, well, I want to study this more. I want to study the games that are being made, such as Cat Park, like Paul talked about, to the tactics and strategies that are being used online. And so from there, I used my passion as a game designer and a hobbyist player alongside my interest as a scholar to start making tools that kind of look at that intersect, where what I design is much more focused on how we interact, how we converse, how we come to understand these systems with the actions that we can take to break them or build them up. And from there, I kind of started looking at disinfo under that lens. And so it's been really cool because I've been able to look at both games as systems for teaching and informing the public, also existing games for how they're doing it. So think about games like Werewolf or Mafia that have these mechanics that are actually very reminiscent of information control, right? The deceiver knows how to kind of mislead, but also looking at the tactics and strategies used by disinformation actors. And so for me, it's kind of like a convoluted path of academia and personal passion that kind of led to where I am today.
Unfortunately, I will not be sharing about what we saw in terms of how Russia, China, and Iran and other threat actors how they use games, which would be a really interesting topic for another panel. Today, we'll just stick on the good sides of what's happening. Okay, but maybe before we get too deep into the games piece, let's go back around the horn. And specifically, I want to ask about what you see as the threats of disinformation. How is it that disinformation is harmful, whether that's a personal harm that you've experienced, like Gamergate, or something that you've observed in sort of, perhaps global politics? So whichever sort of angle you want to take on that. Um, Keisha, I started with you, but if you don't want to go first,
No,
I'm happy.
I'll go. I mean, I'm around different generations of people. Like one of the things I pride myself in is actually immersing myself in the community. Like I know that's like a buzzword, but it's kind of like a human need to have a community and like understand how we're all supposed to be interacting, participating, and so on and so forth. But we've, done so much cognitive outsourcing to digital spaces that now the idea of like just being misinformed, misled, is so easy. We're a populace that through algorithms we're so easy to control, and we're emotionally reacting to things that we can't do anything about when we're completely isolated from the things happening right outside of our door, right outside of our local spaces. So, the idea that we're led to this inaction because of how these digital spaces operate, and they lead us to spaces that aren't necessarily helpful to our mental health, helpful to us being aware of how to act, how to contribute, how to be purposeful, how to be intentional. And like the question is, like we're all talking about AGI and such with AI and how what happens if AI becomes more sentient or something. But I think the real problem is that our population is becoming less sentient. We as human beings are becoming less sentient, not questioning, not observing, being isolated, and this is kind of affecting every aspect of my life, right? When I have people who are, depressed and anxious and fearful about the world that they feel like they can't do anything about. And how sad is that? So, I want to do things that are going to empower individuals. And so, just by nature of being like living in society, seeing how people are impacted, is really important to me to just be in this work, especially with kids, right? We when I speak to young people, the amount of options that they give themselves, the things that they care about are so I think that with where they're at online, they're misled to believe things that aren't real, aren't true, aren't helpful, aren't human. So anyways, I can go on and on about that, but yeah, being community, having the cognitive outsourcing of all the things that are supposed to connect us to other people that we want to help, that we want to connect with, and having that barrier that's not real, kind of is terrifying, to be honest. So
Totally. Yeah. The loss of critical thinking skills. And so the sort of baking in of hallucinations into, I don't know, standard discourse. And the excuse of, oh, sorry, I made the mistake, just the other day. Oh, sorry, I was using an AI tool and it made a mistake. Whoops. Um, Luke, go ahead. The threat of disinformation.
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess to me what stands out is just the fact that um we're all subject to confirmation bias. So when you're getting information, you're kind of pre-deciding about it to some extent based on whether it's like going to kind of confirm or deny some existing assumption that you have. And so I think it's been kind of I think everyone's, just noticed like the kind of impact that can have on just like polarizing discourse on topics. And so yeah, I don't know. I think to me one of the things that was interesting with the project that we were working on is since it's the Roblox platform, we can't be necessarily overtly like it can't be like this is a political game with a political message. But in some ways, maybe it's better that it isn't because we're kind of trying to reach out to some people that um, with what are called inoculation techniques, right, or strategies that you recognize like the shape of what disinformation might look like without it necessarily being on a topic that you already have an opinion about. Um, and so yeah, I think that um, I think that like is kind of trying to solve this issue with like everyone's kind of going in with this kind of confirmation bias where it feels like that polarization could otherwise get like worse and worse.
Yeah. Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the threats of disinformation will also vary to the contexts that are there. And it's also important to recognize that the term itself has now kind of become weaponized in some ways to be a thing, right? When Paul was saying that disinformation is intentionally false information, right? So that's different than someone just making a slip up. And because we have this intent behind it, there's this idea of like these bad actors behind it where you can just start throwing out the term now that this person's a disinformed person or this person's a fake news actor. And that alone kind of creates further uncertainty. I think the nicest way to understand disinformation and the impact it has is to think about the layers and levels in which we can look at it, right? So, personally, when we start reading a lot of fake information or we start getting unsure of what is true and what is false, we get anxious. We can become apathetic. We can feel lonely. We can feel isolated. We can feel trapped because we don't feel like there's an option for us. If we think about it more at a community level, we can start to see fractures where people will have infighting or increased kind of debates about what is the direction they should take in because they took information this way, someone else took information this way, and it creates tensions and struggles there. On a more global or country national scale, you see growing identity politics where polarization around how one should be positioned and someone else's position creates like, well, I won't talk to that person at all, and I won't talk to that person at all. When in reality, a lot of the issues that many of us are dealing with and want to deal with are actually quite similar, but we have these kind of tensions that misleading conversations have kind of boiled down into creating. And so, on the one hand, we have these like threats of literacy where people have a hard time understanding what is going on. And we have these threats of fatigue where people are feeling overwhelmed of like choices and what they can actually do. But at the end of the day, there's this kind of inherent mess and mud that's created to our media ecosystem, where there's just kind of uncertainty across the board of who to trust, when to trust them, and how to trust them. And that's where tools like games might be able to come in. But that's where disinformation starts to become scary because we're not quite sure as a public then who should we actually look to for guidance. Should it be our government? Should it be our media? Should it be our independent journalists? Should it just be our friends that we talk to? And when we're unsure about that, we rely then on gut feelings, and gut feelings are some of the easiest things for people to manipulate because that's emotional. And so that's where I at least personally see a lot of the threats. It's kind of this like sliding scale of like how close to you versus how broad it can become.
All right. Well, let's now jump into how we've used games to try and tackle some of these threats or try and, in some ways either spotlight the issue or try and heal the issues. So I'm going to start sharing the screen again. And Keisha, would you like to go first again?
Sure. So
All right. Give me a second to cue this up. Yeah, go ahead.
the screen shots that you'll see are just kind of the thumbnails for the game. But one of the things that we wanted to do, I wanted to like really utilize the fact that I'm not necessarily in a structure or a system, like an educational institution. I'm not in a nonprofit. I'm not in any of these things. And it allows me the freedom to really, really sort of get as dark as I might think that this situation is. So if you can go to like the third picture I have. So the experience is not only tangible, so you have these cards, these tangible sort of flashcards that are AR enabled. And so it's so interesting because I've been in the world where you put people in front of a screen and you expect all these magical things to happen. But a lot of times, especially in Chicago public schools, I've been asked to like teach tech classes with no computer equipment, no, and like, which is bonkers to me. So I've had to, be creative and use the Socratic method to try to teach some baseline sort of ideas that are on how to innovate, how to use technology tools, how to critically think. So these cards allow us to have a conversation. And then on top of which I get to expand into like some of the emergent technologies that game developers are currently using, like augmented reality, AI. As a matter of fact, I felt like using AI was very important for this, as the misinformation and disinformation and propaganda that we're going to be exposed to moving forward is probably going to be AI generated. and to understand how easy and how quick and how that works, we sort of used AI to create a game, a video game as well, which I don't have like the screenshots of the video game here. But our video game, it takes the player through all the ways we give away our rights with terms of agreement, with, checking off that box if you want to get to this website, so on and so forth. Give your name, give your email address, all these things that we do without thinking just to get from point A to point B, and really sort of teaching the player what the real cost of that can be. Like, if it's free, then that means you're the product. And going through naming a lot of, again, these tactics that are used to be extractive, these tactics that are used to be exploitative. So, but making it I guess fun in the way that, like I don't think that the packaging of a nice, friendly sort of edutainment veneer really sends the message home of how truly dangerous and scary some of this is, and how, like, yeah, we can have this fun simulated experience through cards, through conversations, through augmented reality, through the video game, through events. And so, like, what ties our video game project all together is the tangible, the digital, and the community, in which now you get to be around other people who have also been exposed to sort of the mindful scenario. And very similar to games like Werewolf or Secret Hitler, now we're all in one space, sharing a reality, playing a game with ourselves, with people in the room. So, because how else do you kind of tackle propaganda and disinformation, if not to be in conversation with real people in a real place, sharing a reality? So, yeah, I wanted to not just make it digital, but also, offer a pathway for that human connection, offer some solutions to where we go next. I actually have cards too that are not only naming the psyop, if you will, but also naming the powers of of the powers of community, the powers of giving, the powers of self-reflection, the powers of curiosity, and also going through those steps. And those cards are a lot more colorful, a lot more hopeful. But all of it sort of requires this sort of connection to yourself and your pathway to a connection to others. So, to offset like sort of the scariness of, how, or the darkness of how the game looks and feels, because you can go through, we have over 100 different tactics that we can name that occur in digital spaces. These are just two of them, right? And what are the solutions then? What are the solutions to echo chambers? What are the solutions to cognitive bias? What are the solutions to dark algorithms? How do we navigate those spaces in real time right now? Like, not later, not like, oh, we had fun with this game and it was a great time, but like right now, as soon as you play it, as soon as you look at it, something happens in your brain and you're just like, oh my God, I just went through that today. And, the people that I've given prototypes to this game, of this game too, have, they'll pull a card and sort of like reflect on how this tactic might have shown up in their everyday lives, right? So yeah, I mean, the experience is more comprehensive than just one thing, because what are the rules here, And in 2025, how do you make a game? And I think the answer to that is just to make a fucking game, So, like, otherwise, like, what are we doing? So, and also to like hold the line, right? Because there's so many different ways that the creativity of game development is sort of under attack, right? So I wanted to hit all the points. Like, yes, it can be a board game, card game, video game, social experiment game. all in one. Why not? And so far, this experience, this sort of project, has led to really positive results and outcomes. And even though I've only been able to test it with like a couple of hundred people so far, it's been it's been well received, and it sometimes gets met with a sense of relief that some of these things that are constantly bombarding us and giving us this low level background anxiety, there's names for it and other people recognize what it is, and you can go through it and it's not just you're not crazy. So anyways, that's kind of the impetus of why we made Mindful. What I'm hoping to come from this project, this experience, and how I think that the idea of it being this game format lowers the stakes for a second, right? Because like in real life, it's overwhelming, but if I hand somebody a card game, then the stakes are a little bit lower. Your stress level goes down because it's just a game, right? So anywho's, I think that it gives people a sense of comfort and a sense of camaraderie, even connection, if they have been exposed to the Mindful sort of world, if you will. Like, you played Mindful, I've played Mindful, what's your favorite card, so on and so forth. It's really really awesome to watch, especially with the cards themselves. I don't get the same uh, focus testing that I get with the tangible cards that I do with the video game, right? The video game it's a different experience. We're all in this digital matrix, so if you will, and people's reaction are muted. They're they have this filter that I don't necessarily have to navigate when I'm looking at them sort of go through the augmented reality experience of the card game. So anyways, I hope that like sort of contextualizes why I made it, like this.
No, and I think, right, having something that you can use in, technology environments that might be low tech, right, where you don't have necessarily have access to computers, right? But regardless, you have these cards that can facilitate this conversation because, a lot of parents are not equipped to have these conversations about what their kids are being exposed to on the internet and how to navigate sort of the very intimate, almost schoolyard disinformation. Luke, tell me a bit more about how you've used game, and maybe we'll use the game that we were working on together
Sure.
to counter disinformation.
Yeah, so at Filament we have kind of a framework that we use. It's not that fancy. It sounds more fancy than it is, but we're taking the impact or learning objectives for the project and making sure that those are ideally tied to some kind of like mutual curricular understanding with a subject matter expert. So in the case of this Ukraine game, Paul had recommended to us inoculation.science videos if you want to go check those out. And we added to that some others from some other resources like pre-bunking with Google. Pre-bunking here and inoculation, both the pre and the inoculating is like before you encounter disinformation in the wild, where you might not recognize that you're being disinformed. Let's help you again recognize like the shape that it might come in to give you like a healthy skepticism. It's like you're inoculating you against the virus. Um, and so understanding that like uh there may be scapegoating involved, like that's like one of those pieces to know. Ad hominem attacks, denigrating of expertise, incendiary language, right? These are the kind of things that you're looking for to be like, maybe this thing that I'm being told is coming at me with an agenda. Um, so we get those learning objectives, and then we think in terms of verbs, identities, and systems at Filament. So like, how can I give the player an empowered identity where they can take those learning objectives and like do them actively with some verbs, and then how can the systems give them some feedback? So here we have this digital city where the players are part of this team of influencers that was called Verify, with an I like Wi-Fi. Um, Verify, and they were trying to protect their city against these uh, events that would generate disinformation from a group called the Spin Syndicate. And so the verbs that you had access to here, first of all, because it's a Roblox game, it's got kind of like a jet set radio run around the city kind of thing. And then there's digital billboards that are kind of trying to mimic like social media posts, where you can amplify information that you think is true, and you can assemble your post out of like the message and the image and the color and other elements. You can counter information that you think is not true, and that had to do with reporting which of those inoculation elements you're identifying in the media. So you might say, "Oh, this looks like it's scapegoating this group of people, so I'll submit it as using scapegoating." And then you could educate, which was our solution to like wanting to let you learn how to be the bad actor without putting you literally in that narrative role. So instead, it's like you get invited to districts in the city where you are spreading disinformation as like a training exercise. They know what's going on so that then they can kind of see you applying those techniques. And then over time, this was shifting the influence that Verify versus the Spin Syndicate had in those districts, and also determining how this kind of ongoing narrative was coming out. So we were going to be working with myself as like the literal game master, but it was like AI assisted game master, so that I could keep up with like the community with their like weekly events and be like, oh, because you didn't protect the mayor from this disinformation that's coming out against the mayor, maybe is the mayor going to get reelected or not? We had those kind of things going on in the game. So yeah, that was basically the strategy we used here, was identify those learning objectives and think about what empowered identity we can give the player, what verbs the player can use that turn those learning objectives into game mechanics, and then how the system can give you feedback.
Luke, thank you. Scott, last but not least, go ahead.
For sure. I think I have two slides that show some of the games. Most of the projects that I've worked on are more analog, so the photos of them aren't as easy to translate for everyone, but I'll try my best to explain them. I'm also going to drop a link in the chat to a guide that I made with the United with Ukraine jam that Paul was talking about on how to make disinfo games for anyone who's interested in kind of working in that space. It's meant for the game jam space, so if people are curious, that might be helpful. Excuse me. So some of the game projects I've worked on, they've all had a different goal. So not pictured here, but the first kind of disinfo related game was called Reactile, which was an escape room that was about echo chambers and filter bubbles. And at the core of the design, the question was, how can we use game mechanics to reflect digital systems? And so in that game, we use an escape room, which is a genre of games where people try to escape through puzzles, a specific space. To reflect how algorithms curate feeds for us. And so how that game worked is every single puzzle asked players to input personal information. And as the game went on, that personal information would become part of the room. So for example, you'd be asked to tell us your favorite color, your favorite song, and those songs would start blaring in the room. The room would become that color. And so that game itself was meant to model how these structures work in order to generate conversation. Lizards and Lies, which is the project here, is a board game. It's about how conspiracy theories move on social media. And there's a board that you can kind of see there that has these different like networks and communities online that players are spreading kind of their conspiracy theories about how birds aren't real, or they're trying to stop that spread from online. And this game was looking again at how do we model these digital systems? How can board games reflect the kind of nuances of tactics and strategies around misinforming audiences, where it's not actually about content. It's not about the fact that birds aren't real. It's about which communities do you want to manipulate and how do you want to do that. And so you have conspiracy theorists and you have these kind of like trolling edgelords playing against fact checkers and educators who are trying to kind of react. And each role is meant to show the strengths and difficulties that each have. Where like educators, for example, are really good at informing the public, but just because you're informing people doesn't mean they're responding. So they're great at like having people who can critically think, but bad content can still exist there. And so there's this challenge of how do you mobilize those who have been taught to be critically aware. The other game, so if you want to move to the next slide, Paul. This is one of the more recent projects that I'm working on. This is a pre-alpha image of the game. This is a game where we're having students play the role as journalists. It's a simulation game. It is meant to be played in small groups with middle school students in schools, where they're playing through this kind of chaotic story of this robot that went missing from a lab, and they're playing as journalists that have an inherent bias, and they're trying to deal with the rumors of what's happening, with the facts that they're getting in their reporting, and send headlines out every day to maintain high credibility and still have a good audience. And some actors in the game are not meant to be credible, they're just meant to get a lot of clicks. And so as the class kind of plays together at the same time, there's this kind of back and forth. And this kind of game specifically is meant to have in-group conversation about like how should we make sure that we're properly addressing our audience and our needs, but also have a larger class conversation of like how are headlines being written, what information is being included and excluded in articles, how can certain actors kind of manipulate how the public are seeing information compared to other media actors. And so we're using games as ways to generate conversation on these kind of core themes in and around dealing with this info on a more broad scale. The other game that I don't have pictured here is called The Feed, which is a card game for high school students where you use outrage and satire and conspiracy to kind of manipulate your other friends' news feeds in an attempt to kind of steal their audience from them so that you can become kind of a viral individual. It's not actually telling you that you're a disinformer, but it's showing you how using kind of more disinformation-based tactics, such as dismissing content, distorting what's actually being said, creating dismay in the community, can be powerful ways to get your message across to power.
Uh-oh. Is it
Uh-oh.
just okay? Is it just me who lost Scott, or is it everybody?
I think
Okay,
we all lost
So
them.
we all
No.
lost Scott.
Did I freeze?
Scott, you're back. You froze,
Oh
but you're
no!
back now.
What did I freeze on? What was I last talking about?
You were wrapping up.
I was okay. Yeah, so I was saying is at the end of the day, these games that I'm working on are about generating conversation, showing how the larger structures, like the technical structures of platforms work, and creating space for us to think about what kind of solutions would work here and what wouldn't work here, or what is needed to make these solutions work, right? Is it just about getting new curriculum in the hands of teachers, or is it about policy on the other side as well? Is it about keeping platforms accountable? Is it about kind of creating incentives for people to not be disinformed or to not disinform in the same way? And so it's using games not just as research tools and not just as educational tools, but in both of those domains.
Thank you to the three of you. We are starting to get some questions to trickle in. Let's see. I'm just gonna read them to you, and you guys can answer. So this first question comes from Bell. Would you say that there's an ideal age to start teaching people about disinformation, or any demographic that is more at risk of succumbing to disinformation? So whoever wants to take on that question, go ahead.
Is that the age question, the age related question?
Sure. Yeah. Let's start with the age piece.
For me, I think immediately. I think that teaching critical thinking skills is something that you embed cognitively into your fellow human immediately. Specifically because I mean it's just like, stranger danger, say no to drugs, so on and so forth, all these things that we used to teach kids at least, whereas like, hey, if someone comes up to you and you don't know them, what do you do, right? And like now in our digital spaces, essentially that has been lost. In real life, we're just like, oh, if a stranger comes up to you and hands you candy, you say no. But in online, you're like, if a stranger wants to play with you on Roblox, hey, go ahead. And like we have this false sense of safety in our digital spaces that I think that we need to sort of upgrade our societal norms to also prepare kids as soon as possible, as soon as they're scrolling on their touch screen, as soon as that is occurring. I think that teaching observation, critical thinking, pausing, and just really sort of figuring out, like, is this safe, just encouraging how one protects themselves in these spaces. I don't think you can start too early, honestly.
Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can jump in here. So teaching disinformation or teaching about disinformation falls into the larger categories of media literacy or information literacy education, which generally, depending on your country and or your state or your province, it's going to vary on when they're actually doing it in the school system. But at the heart of teaching people about like the fact that there is information that is false, I actually think that conversation can start as young as a kid is able to actually process a conversation. Think about like a toddler or a 3-year-old who's just asking why constantly, partially because they're annoying, but there's a certain part in there where they're actually curious about the world and what's going on, and they're asking, why is this the case? Why is this the case? Why is this the case? And that typical question is actually the basis of being a critical thinker, is asking, why is this working? Why is this the message I'm hearing? Why is this how I'm working? And so I'm not going to go to a 3-year-old and talk about how there's large scale disinformation movements that might be motivated by financial and military complexes, but I might be having a conversation of like, hey, when you hear something, it's great to ask why and keep asking why, even if as a parent it can be grating to hear that question over and over again. And there's ways that you can talk about disinformation and engaging with the media around like healthy habits, around what is being safe online, that kind of feed into being a critical individual in a digital society. Where disinformation, often we talk about it as a digital issue because today it's been exacerbated or made worse by platforms that are out there, when in reality, there's been concerns about fake news and media manipulation that go back hundreds and hundreds of years. And so it's not just around digital technology, but teaching people to be critical of the information they come across in life in general. And that comes to the core of just being able to ask questions about the world you're in, which we can teach at a very young age. To your second question about demographics that are more at risk, there is research that talks about different groups. So, for example, I'm in Canada. In the Canadian case, we saw during COVID that Indigenous and Black communities were more likely to succumb to vaccine hesitancy or vaccine disinformation because they have a history of the state kind of a space that they don't trust. And so when the state was telling them to take this drug, they were more likely to be hesitant to take that drug. And that can be different. That's going to be different on different contexts for sure. There are audiences that, depending on the type of disinfo, they might be more likely to fall to it. But there's not like a blanket form of disinfo that like I can give you for talking about that. It is context and information specific. In general, when we're talking about digital disinfo, lack of media literacy, so understanding how digital environments and context works, does feed into kind of a higher propensity for falling for things such as scams we see, which is a bit of a side note to disinfo. And so often we talk about how you hear the myths that like old people are more likely to fall for scams and they're more likely to fall for disinfo, and that's not actually the case. When you look at the literature, it's actually the people who that divide is much less age based and much more income and knowledge based, where it's people who have less accessibility to technology and the tools to understand it generally struggle to engage with it. And that is not an age based thing. There are groups in North America, at least I can speak to, that are still just getting internet access today. And for them, right, there's a vulnerability there. And that's not an age question, that is a community specific question that looks at larger infrastructures there. So hopefully that addresses the question.
Really quick, I would just like to add to just listening to everything that Scott was saying. I think that it starts young and is continuous. We never stop learning about this ever. Like I think that we should always be engaged with, things in the world that are, propaganda, disinformation, misinformation. So you start young, continuous, all sorts of different, angles with this.
I'm going to move on to the next question just for the sake of time. How do you gain and maintain the trust of your audience? Whoever wants to take that one on first.
I think this is part of why it's important to think about how directly political you want your game to be, like in terms of the content. Like if it's a climate-based game, if you're coming out with a game that's like pro-climate, is it targeting people that are already generally on board with being pro-climate, but are like learning something kind of more nuanced that could be helpful for them to be like more successful in advocating for it? Or are you trying to like convert someone that's maybe not already in that headspace? And if so, then is coming at it with something that they might just kind of see and be like, oh, this is one of those climate persuading games, right? Kind of a detriment. So yeah, I don't know. Gosh, gaining trust is a tough one, but like in those terms it's tough. But I mean, I think the same as any other game marketing, just something to think about is like what's the box cover of your game and what kind of player is that going to draw toward your game or push away, is definitely something to think about. And then as far as how you make the player um then trust you in particular, I honestly don't know if I have an answer to that question. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and I want to give Keisha and Scott the opportunity to reflect on that question as well, but maybe tie in this second question about how do you make the player care about the issue?
I mean, for me, it's actually showing up in community spaces, which is not a profitable game marketing tactic. So, but it is a effective way to garner trust. I treat my community like a community, not a consumer base. So, what does that mean to me as a human being? And that means like showing up in schools, showing up at different like art events, and then again having the cards allows me to like just whip it out so people aren't like confused as to what it is. So because it's an augmented reality experience, anyways, I am a human attached to what I'm doing. And that immediately, intuitively sort of connects me with people. And that's been a really interesting process. And it does garner trust and it does grow, I guess, the audience. And it does, it's helpful, but it's not scalable in the way that most game marketing would be, right? So it's all word of mouth. You don't find Mindful finds you. And how do I make the players care? Well, I think that to be honest, I do use a little bit of fear mongering. The game is sort of scary, and it's just like, oh, whoa, and it kind of has like that impact where people again, it's a game still, so it's like propaganda. Oh my God, that's scary. Game. Oh, I can do that. And so that kind of gets people to care, but on their own terms, So that's been an interesting process for me, but I don't necessarily think that it fits into traditional marketing tactics that most game companies might use to gain audience trust or scale a community. So because we don't, in the gaming industry, we look at people as numbers, not people.
This last question was for Keisha, but I'm going to adapt it for the three of you, and ask you to keep your answers maybe to 30 seconds for the sake of time. So, what have you found most useful or out of the box that has been effective as a game approach? Right. Hopefully I'm adapting this question well enough, but like, what tools have you used or found that are perhaps out of the box or non-conventional as a game mechanic we're thinking about the design of your game?
My 30-second answer is making people uncomfortable. So, I games are, again, they're simulations, and like they are fun, but it's because you are able to beat the game. You're able to win at something. It's low stakes, right? But in that narrative output of what the game is, I strive to make people sort of realize that they're uncomfortable because they're simulating something that they've done in real life.
Luke or Scott, go ahead. Something that you found that works.
Yeah, I can jump in. I was actually going to say discomfort as well. I think for me, the most effective tactic in these kind of games is actually emotion. An affect is a term people will use, where there's room to have mechanics not always feel good, but feel weird or interesting or awkward, and use that awkwardness to drive conversation. Like this felt not great. And it's like, why didn't that feel great? Oh, yeah, because it kind of sucks to fact check all this bad information and it leads to burnout. Like that feels bad. So you could understand how that works. And people always think that games have to be fun, but the word fun is so ambiguous, where it's like less about fun and more about the emotional and effective responses you want from that engagement. that's my 30 seconds.
Luke, go ahead.
There's like a bunch of different possible things, but I don't know the one that's standing out in my mind. Yeah.
No problem. All right. Well, maybe then I'll give you guys each another 30 seconds for one final reflection question if the audience will allow us to go a couple minutes over here. One piece of advice and something that you would love to see come out of this jam. So whoever wants
Uh,
to go in 30 seconds or less.
I mean, I don't know. Make it anyway. I know, like, that's probably the worst piece of advice to hear, but make whatever game you have, whatever your excuse is, whatever's the barrier, do whatever you can to make it anyway. Like, especially if it's something that's designed to help us at a time of that we urgently sort of need this help, this connection, this play, right? This education. Like, whatever it is that you got to do it anyway. Do it scared, do it broke, do it, where you feel like you're not prepared to do it. Run your reps. I think that that's kind of what being a gamer and working in the gaming industry baseline is all about. Like, how do you win? Keep going.
All right. Thank you, Keisha. One final piece of advice or thing that you would like to see come out of the jam, Scott or Luke?
Yeah, I'll go. Disinformation is broad. It covers a lot of topics. So if you are in this jam and they're talking about natural disasters and disasters in general, disinformation probably matters to that in some capacity. And so don't feel like you're pigeonholed or you're stuck in how you want to look at it. Think about the thing that you're interested in. Design something around that, no matter how good or how bad or whatever term you want to use. Don't use those binaries anyways. Make something about where your interests are and let that disinfo piece kind of sit among that kind of mud. And you'll come to something really cool at the end of the day.
And Luke, final word.
Sure. Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, yeah, if you're working on a game that's more conventionally climate, maybe just thinking about like how people talk about the climate could be part of like the system of your game, just like how information is spreading.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for spending this hour with us. Good luck. All of us are here to be resources for you, guys. If you want to drop your emails, maybe in the chat, that way, if folks want to reach out to us, we are here to be resources.